Today, we have a side event at the COP28 in Dubai called Shifting Money and Power, True Transformational Climate Action as a Peace and Justice Multiplier. I want to open this side event with a moment of silence to uphold those who are not in the room, nature, the most vulnerable communities, and those yet unborn. Thank you. And thank you for everyone here, and thank you, amazing panelists. This side event is sponsored or co-hosted by the Quaker United Nations Office, the Friends World Committee for Consultation, Burton Yearly Meeting, Quaker Earth Care Witness, and Soka Gakkai International. We are so proud to be here, and thank you for all coming together. I'm going to start first by asking all of you to turn to the person next to you. If you have someone nearby, if not, go sit next to them. And for just a few minutes, just talk to them about what does true transformational climate action mean to you?
I was waiting. No, for us to start challenging every even the notion of development itself. The model of development has brought us to this stage where just destroyed our planet. So much of inequality. There's something dramatically wrong. For me, transformation means really looking at system change. Unless we start with that conversation, it will not be effective.
Yeah, system change, exactly. And that's indigenous in the Nordic countries,
Thank you. I'm going to draw you back in.
I totally agree.
So each of our speakers is going to speak on true transformational climate action within their sector. And the reason that we focus on shifting money and power is because often in the rooms that we see now in the negotiating rooms, the decisions being made may not be the decisions made because they are the most urgent, effective, equitable, fair, healthy, and human rights-based climate action available. They may be decisions being made to avoid the root causes, because root causes are often very lucrative activities. They may be the decisions that are defined by those of power and money. And this is why we looked at, if we were to shift power and money, could we have more equitable, urgent, healthy, rights-based, and fair climate action now? Each panelist will speak for approximately 5 minutes, and the idea is that you get a breadth of understanding from the different sectors, and then we want to have time for the audience to ask questions and engage. So I encourage you, write down your questions as our wonderful speakers are speaking. And I have asked them each 3 questions to frame their special place. The first question was, what does true transformational climate action mean to you? What shifts in the current money power structures we experience could help deliver more true transformational climate action as a peace and justice multiplier? And finally, if there's time, a few examples. Our first speaker is actually a video. It is with Dr. Yamina Saheb. She is an IPCC author, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change author, from the mitigation report, but her work also walked into the synthesis report. And Yamina is an engineer, economist, and PhD in energy. She worked as a building expert in the Environment and Energy Efficiency Department in the International Energy Agency, where she created and directed the Sustainable Buildings Center. She is now a senior energy policy analyst at Open Experience. And she's also a member of the IPCC since 2018, and she has boycotted this COP because she feels that it will lock in fossil fuels. But she's agreed to give us a video on the economic money and power shifts for a more sustainable economic system.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. We have all witnessed during the last decade, again, an increase of global greenhouse gas emissions. This increase occurred while at the same time we witnessed the expansion of climate mitigation policies to more sectors and more regions, and the fall in the unit cost of renewable energy technologies. Importantly, the current and planned policies are keeping us in this path and will lead us towards more than 2 degrees of global warming by the end of the century compared to the pre-industrial era. Today we are at crossroads. We either stay in this path, which is a wrong path for humanity, or we decide collectively for a new, different path. This different path is a path that requires us to unlock ourselves from our silos and from the techno-solutionist approach to climate policies. This path requires us to embrace sufficiency. Sufficiency is not a new concept. It pre-existed the climate and the ecological crisis. The novelty is the inclusion of sufficiency in one of the decarbonization framings considered in the IPCC report. Sufficiency, as defined by IPCC, is a set of policy measures and daily practices that avoid demand for all natural resources, including energy, materials, water, and land, while delivering well-being for all within planetary boundaries. By having the well-being for all at its core, sufficiency sets the floor below which no one could be left behind. And by considering planetary boundaries, sufficiency sets the ceiling above which some of human activities will destroy the ecosystem that supports life on this planet. When you dig deeper to what sufficiency is about, you realize that sufficiency is about human rights for all, without distinction of income, place of birth, or place of living. And this is why sufficiency requires us a metamorphosis of our vision of the world. Sufficiency should be considered first in the design of all our policies. But this is not the case today. If you look at, for example, decarbonization of the transport sector, today's focus is in the most progressive climate policies. It is about mainly shifting the existing fleet, so the solution that is already there of individual cars, towards electric vehicles. By doing that, we will reduce emissions from transport sector by moving these emissions from transport to the mining industry and to the production of electricity. It happens that mining for producing electric vehicles is occurring in the global south with its high societal and environmental cost for indigenous populations. And electric vehicles are not affordable by all of us. Electrical vehicles, even in the G7 countries, are not affordable by low-income families. So basically, with our current approach to decarbonization, we are only increasing emissions, overall emissions, by displacing sometimes emissions from one sector to another or from one region to another, while exacerbating inequalities, north-south inequalities, and within countries inequalities. We know that with the planned policies, we are going in this direction. And we also know that we could reduce emissions from current policies, from emissions projected from current policies by more than 70% if sufficiency policies would be considered. Including sufficiency in the IPCC report was an important first step. Making sufficiency delivering on both the decarbonization end inequalities and ending inequalities requires us to work together to ensure sufficiency will be considered first in our climate and environmental policies. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Yamina. And if you're looking at the IPCC 6th Assessment Report, the mitigation, Chapter 5 and other chapters, sufficiency comes in. Do read it. It's revolutionary. The next speaker is Harjeet Singh, and the area that he's speaking on is equity. Harjeet has to leave quickly, so we're going to just briefly say what an amazing person he is. I've known him many years now. He is head of global political strategy at Climate Action Network International and global engagement director at the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative. He is a member of the United Nations Technical Expert Group on Comprehensive Risk Management under the Warsaw International Mechanism for Loss and Damage. Equity, Harjeet.
Thank you so much, Jen. My apologies. I generally don't like doing that, but this is a crunch time and there are many engagements, so I have to. Speaking of equity and being in this space for some time, I can tell you equity has been treated as a toxic word by developed countries. As if this is something, an unreasonable demand being put by developing countries to delay action. But the reality is exactly the opposite. The fact is, rich countries have not delivered their fair share of climate action, and developing countries are left to choose between feeding people or putting a solar panel. So you know what they are going to choose. And that's the reality we are facing. And when it comes to operationalizing equity, at the very core is climate finance, the issue which has seen least progress in these climate negotiations. You tell me, if we don't provide support to developing countries, who are known as developing countries because they still have millions of people living in poverty. We are talking about 600 million people in Africa who don't have access to electricity, or 1 billion people who don't have access to clean cooking, and 100 million people in India who don't have access to adequate electricity. So that's the reality we are facing. But when we talk about equitable action from developed countries, they shirk their responsibility. And as we speak, the language on equity is bracketed. So I'm talking of global goal and adaptation, but that's true for majority of the text. The text that came out today has 3 options on equity and common but differentiated responsibilities. The third option is no text. So you can understand who wants that no text. Because the moment you put that text, which means that rich countries who are responsible for the climate crisis will have to do a lot more. So that's the reality we are facing, and especially when developing countries do not have resources, how they are going to really escalate action from mitigation to adaptation and loss and damage. And something that I have been saying in this space, and Lindsey, you know my engagement with loss and damage, I used to say the sequencing itself is wrong in this space. We started talking about mitigation, and then when impact started increasing, we worked on adaptation, and now when things have gone out of control, we are saying let's address loss and damage. We should have talked about loss and damage in 1993, when we were beginning to implement the convention, saying we cannot afford to see loss and damage. So what we need to do, we should be addressing the cause of the climate crisis, which is fossil fuels. And look at how for 30 long years, we didn't even talk about fossil fuels in this space, which are responsible for about 80% of greenhouse gas emissions. And look at this space. We always knew that fossil fuels not being mentioned in the convention or Paris Agreement are linked to some kind of lobbying happening, some kind of underhand game being played by fossil fuel lobbies and industry. It's now in our face. Over the last 3 COPs, the moment we started talking about it, look at how the number of lobbyists are roaming around and trying to prevent. When we talk about equity, look at how developed countries are increasing their fossil fuel expansion. That's not equity. You are pointing towards others and say that you phase out of coal. So countries who only have coal, they're burning coal because they have no access to, let's say, storage technology, even if they have huge potential of renewable energy. But where is the upfront investment that's coming? As an Indian citizen, I also put a lot of pressure on my own country. I live in Delhi, which is the polluted city in the world. But when I look at the green financing in India, 80% is from domestic sources. So the fact is, even a country like India, which has shown that kind of leadership, of course it must do more, is left entirely on its own, which means the operationalization of equity is not happening. And if we don't do that, we can only keep putting unreasonable pressure on developing countries, as it is happening right now. I don't want to get into negotiations, but that's what is happening. Mitigation work program, you talk about global stock take, you talk about loss and damage. It's the principle of equity that has been compromised the most. Human rights. Rich countries try to portray that they are the champion of human rights because they can use those words. If you don't provide finance and people are dying and they're not able to protect their homes, is not that violation of their human rights? You only want human rights in the text, but not being operationalized. You provide money, and then if developing countries are not doing enough, strengthen civil society, make sure money is spent well. We all want that money to be spent well. That's equity. You don't play your part, you only put pressure and you think that's going to be equity or that's going to be about human rights because you can talk about it. And this is exactly the reason we have something that governments must have done. We have this equity review, and I would request you, I only have one copy, so I can't leave this one here, but please go to civilsociettyreview.org. Since 2015, a large group of civil society organizations have been actually producing these reports, and this report is now about actually telling who needs to phase out first when it comes to fossil fuels. And we have a graph based on the historical responsibility, capacity. These are the kind of details. We need to operationalize equity. We need to talk about, and that's why even UNSG said, rich countries have to phase out of fossil fuels first. They have to provide finance. That's about operationalizing equity. The fight that we are having right now on global goal adaptation is so weak on finance. So if we have to only come up with targets and do on our own, that's not equity. We can do that anywhere else. We don't have to come to these negotiations. We can organize, and all these conversations on actions. We can do those actions in different kind of expos as this COP has become. We need this. This is a place for justice, and you can't achieve justice unless equity is in letter as well as spirit. So, and equity is not just about morality, it is that, but it is also about practical necessity. Developing countries don't have resources. And now with loss and damage, whatever resources they should have spent on adaptation and mitigation, they are spending to deal with climate impacts and recover from those impacts. So that's why I was saying sequencing. So you expect developing countries to do more, but they are diverting their scarce resources now on humanitarian response. So equity is at the core of everything that we do. If we don't operationalize it, which means if rich countries don't provide resources, we will never be able to deal with the crisis, and that's exactly the reason we have failed over the last 30 years. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Harjeet. Operationalization of equity in shifting money and power, and upholding equity and making sure that it is not cut from the text, which happens. Our next speaker is zooming in. Thank you, Harjeet. And all the speakers here will be able to follow on from equity. So while we'll miss you, we uphold you. Our next speaker is zooming in from the University of Leeds, Professor Olaf Corry. His sector that he will address is energy, and he will be looking at shifting money and power for more effective, sustainable, and just energy systems. Professor Corry is Professor of Global Security Challenges at University of Leeds, where he teaches classes in international politics, security studies, and international relations and the environment. He is currently researching the international politics of climate geoengineering technologies. Olaf.
Thank you very much, Lindsey, and thank you for inviting me here. And I'm sorry not to be with you in person. So the three quick points that I want to make today are not about solar geoengineering, but more about these abatement technologies like CCS and like negative emissions technologies or carbon dioxide removal. As we've heard from the other speakers, there are lobbyists and there are strong interests in the continuation of the current economic model. But what I want to talk about today is how there are some assumptions in the IPCC's, almost all of the IPCC's scenarios, which also bake in intergenerational inequity in terms of energy and economics. So the first point, the abatement technologies that are being debated where you are, they are deemed necessary partly because of the difficulty of reducing or reluctance in reducing emissions over these last 3 decades, but also because there are assumptions about economic growth built into those scenarios. So all but a handful of them, and thankfully this is beginning to change, but it's in a way crazy that it until now has not been modeled for the future, is that all but a handful of the scenarios assume 2% economic growth in all countries, whether they're incredibly rich or incredibly poor, every year, 2% compound growth rate until the year 2100. So the idea that there might be some contraction in the richer part of the world and some convergence and contraction has not yet been properly explored in the scientific literature, although there is an EU-funded project which is now beginning to do that. So the 2% economic growth rate, rich or poor, and on top of that, a continued energy inequality is also baked into almost all the scenarios. So forwards to year 2100, approximately 2.3 times the energy consumption in the OECD countries compared to global South countries is still projected to be the world we will be living in. So it's on that basis that we get some absolutely eye-watering assessments and estimates of how much abatement, how many negative emissions, how many gigatons of carbon are we planning to, or hoping to, in these scenarios, promising to remove from the atmosphere. By a median version of these scenarios, 700 gigatons will have to be removed between now and 2100. These are eye-watering, almost impossible figures. One scenario, which is, again, within the median range, estimates that even by the year 2100, with a drawdown, there will be still 12 gigatons per year removed by a technology which usually in the models is bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. So while the proponents of these technologies correctly say that the IPCC deems them necessary, the scale of what is necessary is partly conditioned by some of the assumptions that I just mentioned, that if we do not consider some kind of contraction as well as decarbonization, then we will be requiring eye-watering amounts of carbon dioxide removal or sort of these things to deal with overshoot. So when the proponents say you can't take anything off the table, we need both. The one thing that has already been taken off the table in the basis of what we're talking about, on the basis of these UN scenarios, is the idea that some countries might not need to grow as much, or indeed some parts of those countries, the wealthier parts, might need to contract. So that has been in some ways taken off the table even before the debate starts. Secondly, even if these possibilities, these technologies were possible at that scale, they would of course be catastrophic for biodiversity, for food security, the ones that depend on biological storage and biological forms of capture, so in the form of, for example, biofuels, that would then be fed into carbon capture and storage power stations. The amount of arable land is estimated that would be required for that is 25 to 80% of existing global arable land. Or sometimes it's illustrated by saying it's 3 times the size of India in terms of the land use that would be required if BECCS, or bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, was the sole source of that. Now, obviously, it would never be the sole source, but still, these are the dimensions that we're looking at. The potential for land grabbing, for the displacement of small farmers or indigenous peoples, people with less secure tenure on land, is enormous. Added to that, carbon markets could actually exacerbate this if they serve to transfer reductions in emissions cuts from OECD countries, where primarily those cuts would be fossil fuel cuts, replacing those with global South biological carbon capture and storage, where it ostensibly should be cheaper, and through the market mechanism, this would transfer a lot of climate risk from the global north to the global south again. So if we say, as President Al-Jaber says, about being realistic and pragmatic, then this must also apply to these scenarios and these carbon removal technologies, which from any pragmatic point of view are completely unsustainable. The third final point is that a lot of technologies have shown themselves to be much quicker to ramp up and to develop. The costs of solar have famously absolutely come down at staggering speed, and the rollout has beaten all projections consistently. Every projection every year by the International Energy Authority is outperformed by these technologies. There is one set of technologies that is an exception to that, and that is CCS, carbon capture and storage. This has consistently failed to materialize. It's going to need huge investments, and often those investments are beginning to go to the same companies in the same sectors that are still extracting fossil fuels from the ground. So what is to be done? I think, of course, prioritize the near-term emissions reductions, keeping fossil fuels in the ground, replacing those with renewables, but also contraction and convergence. It will be necessary. Secondly, we need to start to at least begin to model how would that contraction look. Degrowth is often dismissed as dangerous or impracticable, but we've actually not done the research in the scenarios to find out what would happen. Maybe there would be some serious repercussions in the global south if the global north contracted in certain ways or at certain speeds, and maybe there's things to learn there. But the scientific community and the modelers need to start taking these scenarios of convergence and contraction onto their desks and into the IPCC, so they're not just a footnote. I stop there.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Olaf, and thank you for staying with us. I'm sure there may be some questions coming at the end, and it's early there in Britain, so appreciation to Olaf for zooming in so early. I just want to highlight what he was saying about assumptions made. It's constant. What we need to be constant in this space. What are the assumptions being made? I speak as an IPCC active observer. Most of us do not understand what goes into those modelings. So we're looking at the output, but we don't actually understand that, for example, equity is not actually brought in to most, if not all. He said a handful only of those modelings. So we're looking at projections that don't actually look at equity. They also project economic growth, which the IPCC has said at this level of economic growth is a main driver of greenhouse gas emissions. So we need to understand and educate. Also, as an expert on CCS, if you have any questions, when we're out in those negotiating rooms and you hear the word unabated or abated, we're talking about pumping it often in the ground or asking trees to somehow bring it in, and Olaf can speak to some of the details of those with more questions. But I move now to Catherine Robinson. Catherine is going to speak on the human rights sector. And Catherine works with natural justice in Africa and across regions within Africa. She is head of campaigns and communications at Natural Justice. She has worked in both regional and international NGOs for 10 years on policy, advocacy, campaigning, and media work to advance gender, economic and climate justice, LGBTQ+ rights, South feminist alternatives, youth leadership, and Palestinian solidarity. Catherine.
Thanks so much. And thanks for the invitation and to the other speakers. Today marks International Human Rights Day. It also marks the final day of the 16 days of activism to end violence against women. And this year is the 75th anniversary of the United Nations Declaration on Human Rights. And after over 7 decades of progress and implementation of the United Nations Declaration on Human Rights, we are increasingly seeing rollbacks of human rights violations of universal and fundamental human rights. We have an oppressive economic order that is at odds with and in conflict with our human rights regime, in conflict with climate justice, social, gender, and intergenerational justice. Our multilateral and global system is increasingly geared towards economic growth, trade, and profit, rather than human rights and sustainable development. Our world trade regimes are binding, while human rights obligations are largely voluntary and non-binding. Human rights are not equally and universally afforded. They are respected for some and not respected for others. So as we commemorate the 75th anniversary of the United Nations Declaration on Human Rights, we're still witnessing terrible atrocities across the world. On average, one land and environmental defender has been killed every 2 days since 2012, either for defending their rights to land, or resisting fossil fuels, or resisting false solutions. Today, we're still seeing crimes against humanity, apartheid, genocide playing out. We live in a world where ceasefires and people's rights to life and to self-determination are repeatedly vetoed by colonial states. We live in a world wherein wars are sanctioned and cheered on, war criminals are flush with billions, while public coffers for climate finance, financing for development, financing for social protection, gender equality, and universal health care are zeroed by austerity measures, leading to developing countries spending more on debt servicing than fulfilling their human rights obligations to use maximum resources for the full enjoyment of their citizens' universal human rights. The IPCC confirms in its summary to policymakers in its latest sixth AR6 report that adaptation, mitigation must prioritize equity, social justice, climate justice, and human rights-based approaches, and inclusivity. And these would lead to more sustainable outcomes, reduce trade-offs, and support transformative change, and advance climate-resilient development. And likewise, parties who signed up to the Paris Climate Agreement have international human rights obligations and have confirmed, in the context of the Paris Climate Agreement, to respect and promote and consider human rights in the context of climate action. So to answer the question around transformational climate action, a human rights-based approach is both foundational and critical. And this means advancing and centering a full package of human rights in both the negotiations of all UNFCCC processes, as well as the planning, implementation of climate mitigation, NDCs, adaptation, finance policies, as well as stock-taking processes at regional and international levels. And these policies should center and respect and promote rights of the most impacted by climate change. And those are indigenous people, women and girls in all their diversity, people with disabilities, workers, young people, and those who will inherit this world of multiple and intersecting polycrises. And of course, these are people largely from the global south. So for shifting power and money for transformational climate action to advance peace and justice, we really must focus on the reclamation of multilateralism that resists and dismantles the colonial and corporate capture of human rights spaces. We need to address the zero-sum game of fossil fuel access to the UNFCCC negotiations, which has led to the persistent shrinkage of civic space in UNFCCC processes and limited space for frontline communities. And of course, this has led to the dilution and the sidelining and undermining, and crucially, the rolling back of human rights, which has delayed and denied climate justice in the UNFCCC negotiations and across other intergovernmental spaces. So really we need people-led multilateralism that serves people and planet. This does require system change in our governments, our global governance system and our economic regime. And it really demands that we collectively fortify our rights, fortify our fight for human rights and justice to safeguard the integrity of hard-won human rights and defending the foundational principles which are critical for the success of the Paris Climate Agreement, which, as Harjeet has mentioned already, equity, CBDR, and historical responsibility. And we really need to redouble our efforts to hold states accountable to their obligation to protect and fulfill human rights. We must intensify our alignment and advancement and expansion of human rights language under the UNFCCC negotiations and across other human rights and multilateral processes. And really remember and continue to remind parties and corporations that there is no climate justice without human rights, and there's no peace without justice. If we want to see this play out at the national level or at the regional level, I can tell you later a bit about what natural justice does in the absence of, or rather in the context of poly-crises, what we can do with and for communities through legal empowerment work and through litigation. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine, and happy Human Rights Day to everyone. Catherine, as she mentioned, if there are any questions, the specific cases that they have done in Africa are quite profound to hear, so hopefully one of those questions will feed in to allow. I've been very strict on time, but I also want to say how the IPCC has really brought in or confirmed the research of human rights-based approaches in climate action as more effective. So when you see a pushback on human rights, you can say if you avoid an integration, you will actually not enable your society to feel this is fair and part and benefiting them, and it will backfire. That's another way we engage with this with the negotiators. But I'm going to move on to military. Deborah Burton, who has been one of the voices bringing in the questions about military emissions, military spending, and militarism into this space in a way that is desperately needed, but is now really starting to blossom in, well, wrong word, in the COP28 and more. Deborah is the co-founder of Tipping Point's North-South, cooperative that supports and initiates creative campaigning-driven products that advance global social justice agenda. And her career began in film before joining the peace movement and later Christian Aid on trade justice. She has co-founded Tipping Point's North-South in 2009. Deb.
Thank you, Lindsey. And just to echo what Catherine said, thank you so much for the invitation to be part of this amazing panel and fascinating topic. So, Amnesty International has said that the failure of our governments to act on the climate crisis in the face of overwhelming scientific evidence may well be the biggest intergenerational human rights violation in history. And as extensions of their respective governments, the big militaries of the world have most certainly played their part in this over the decades. And I'm just going to come directly to the questions that Lindsey asked us to think about. And the first question was, what does true transformational climate action mean to me? So I just want to explain the scale of the problem first, briefly. The global military are estimated to account for 5.5% of global greenhouse gas emissions, and that is on partial and patchy data. And to put this in context, 1.4 billion people of the 54 countries on the African continent are responsible for 3.5% to 4% of global greenhouse gas emissions. By 2030, when we are meant to have cut emissions by 45%, the big military spenders of the world, this is just 7 years, will have allocated approximately $13 trillion to their utterly fossil fuel reliant militaries. Also by 2030, the UN's high-level expert group on climate finance last year said that developing nations, excluding China, need to raise some 2.4 trillion a year for clean energy and climate resilience. So to answer the question, what does true transformational climate action mean to me and those of us working on this topic? It means putting the role and responsibility of the big, heavily fossil fuel-reliant militaries in the climate change frame and mandating them to give full and transparent reporting of their emissions. It means fully understanding that these military emissions are enabled by those nations with high military spending. It means recognizing that cuts to military emissions can only happen by cuts to military spending. There is a positive correlation between the two. And it means understanding that cuts to military spending can be win-win for the climate and climate finance. So to the second question we were asked to think about, what shifts in the current money, power structures would help deliver true transformational climate action as a peace and justice multiplier? To shift money and power in relation to military spending, what would this look like? Well, G20 nations account for 87% of global military spending, which is running at $2.2 trillion annually. Military spending has increased 20% in the past 10 years, and all this is before Ukraine and now Gaza. Since military spending reflects and reinforces economic power, regional power, the military-industrial complex is ingrained in the economies of wealthy countries. For example, in the UK, the defense budget is the fourth largest item of expenditure. And in the USA, that country alone accounts for 40% of global military spending. It is utterly integrated into the fabric of the American economy. Collectively, the 31 member countries of NATO account for half of that global annual military spending. NATO member countries account for $1.1 trillion of military spending per year. So in the midst of an existential planetary crisis, what are we seeing? We are seeing the intensification of military actions. Military objectives being put above climate targets. Arms industry profits soaring. A major shift in money and power in relation to military spending means giving real value for money. Prioritizing and investing in the things that give communities and societies real safety. That is proper climate finance, conflict prevention and peace building, pandemic preparedness, and yes, upending, and we've talked about it a lot, upending economic inequality. All these elements are central to human safety. And finally, to the last question, which was to give some examples, I'm actually going to give a big picture example of what can be done when you have political leadership that knows the time has come to paradigm shift, to face monumental challenge and make the change because you must. When the Soviet Union collapsed peacefully, an entire empire collapsed peacefully, thanks to one man, primarily Mikhail Gorbachev. He took the decision to cut back the military. Soviet military spending fell dramatically, and guess what? So did the USA's. We reached the lowest post-war level of military spending in the mid-1990s. We need the trillions spent on war machines, such as we are seeing in Gaza and Ukraine, redirected. In this way, humanity will receive the peace dividend and the climate dividend it so deserves and needs. Thank you.
Thank you, Deb. And when I first met her last year, she said to me Don't use the word security, use the word safety. What really makes us safe? Is it weapons that kill people? Or is it transformational action on these planetary crises to transform the root causes in our activities for a more healthy life on Earth? Thank you, Deb. I'm going to move now to Adamu Amadou. He has come to us to look at land and food. And he is one of the voices that I would say is closest, as with Gunn-Britt, to the ground of the community affected. He is here as the national president of the Moro, is this correct? Moro, Social and Cultural Development Association, an organization that defends the rights of indigenous nomadic pastoral peoples in Cameroon. And I welcome you here. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Lindsey, and thank you, everybody, for coming. I will try my best to speak in English because I told you that I would be fluent in French, though there is no French translation. However, I'm happy to be here. I'm glad to follow my neighbor because we have quite a similar background, starting with documentary filming. So then to go to another field. Well, as Lindsey said, we on the ground, we live the everyday life, and we live in the nature with the nature, by the nature, every day. I'm representing the pastoralist indigenous nomadic people called Moro in Cameroon, and they are part of the subgroup of Fulani people in the Africa, where you find them everywhere. And their livelihood depends on the pastoral land and their cattle. Myself, I have been going through this process from my childhood till my secondary school with my dad, doing transhumance, coming back. But by that time, I didn't know that the nomadic lifestyle was like a kind of safety and a kind of protecting our environment. I thought that it was just living like that, moving here by there, as everybody thinks that mobility is by pure hazard. No, it is not. Mobility helps people and the environment to regenerate. If we take an example, we have a mass full of people standing in one place. You can easily see how the soil is impacted, but while moving from here to there, you can reduce the impact of your footprint on the soil. This is the same with the cattle. They are moving from place to help the environment to regenerate from time to time. And this also helps the environment to be protected naturally without introducing any technology. Their technology is their traditional knowledge. However, beside all this, nomadic people are denied even the access to land. We are not talking about the right to honor the land. Because in Cameroon, for example, when the land reform was put in place in 1974, it was drawn and implemented by the sedentary people. We have till now never got to access to the decision making, being parliamentary or senator. It is there they are making the policy on land ownership. They have what they call valuing the land before obtaining the land title. But nomadism lifestyle is not considered as valuing the land. I used to tell them, for me, herding cattle in a place, for me, is valuing the place. So you should consider this to give me the land title. But we should consider also something, that sedentary people are dealing with place, while nomadic people are dealing with space. We should make this difference. When you are dealing with place, you just have a narrow view of this single place that you can own and you can do whatever you want. When you are dealing with space, you have a bigger overview and you know how to manage. The government of this space asks you or impose you harder work to do that. It's not only in Cameroon. I think in the whole world, in the Saami's area, I study in Norway, where I visited Saami's people. We faced similar cases about land access and land right. While through the traditional knowledge, as I said, we save environment more than anybody. Well, we have what we say from a start. A nomadic people is able to tell you that, okay, in 2 weeks, it will go to rain. The rainy season will go to start. Or the dry season will going to start. Or we will have a huge wind from this place to another place. But now with the climate change, everything is just mixed up, changing. We had the tree that are sacred tree, which nobody can touch. And even I remember when we were children, to pass through a tree, nearby a tree, we say, hey, excuse me, I'm passing nearby you. Maybe I will harm you. That's how we protect our environment. But now everything is caught. We have, in the eastern part of Cameroon, we are lucky enough to live a normal and a very good life in Cameroon, because Cameroon is Africa in miniature. You find grassland, mountains, coastal area, we find rainforest, we have Sahel, savanna, all in one country. But in the eastern part of the region where it is the rainforest, we have French industry cutting every day, destroying forests. The pygmies are now wondering where to live because they are facing Bantus and they are facing the access to land. The same to the savannas nomadic people, because many people are here. I realize that in the panels, I see ocean panels, I see mountain panels or pavilions, I see everything, but I have not seen savannas. And people don't know that if you don't protect savannas, savanna will be destroyed and everybody will move to the forest. It's the same with immigration. If you are not protecting, giving people employment in your country, or if you are destroying employment in Africa, people will move to find you, where they think this is a better life. So at the end, we are protecting environment. People are making money out of that. And we are not receiving any single recompense from that. So day to day, we are hearing, okay, we have this pledge, 1 billion, 1 billion, but we never see anything while we are in force and front of the field. So, and then we are producing, we are giving money to the government, for example, by paying taxes. When it comes to protect nomadic people who protect our environment, our government says, okay, we don't find you because you are moving from here to there. I used to tell them, but when you want to collect taxes, you find us easily. Yes, you find us easily, very easily. So this is really a contrary, and then I should stop here if you have any question. I think to protect a true transformation way of climate change for me is to continue to help the indigenous people to protect. We don't ask more, just help us to protect the environment, and then all of us will be safer. Thank you very much.
want to uphold some of the words that I'm hearing about the impact of our footprint, about the protection of the nomadic people and access to land, about losing touch with nature and the savannah. A word that comes to me that the indigenous people's voice brings to this space is the sacredness of nature. When we lose the sacredness, we have lost the plot, and that's why the indigenous people's voice in this space is ever more essential before we lose the plot. That links me to another part of the world, but a part that you also have studied in. As you mentioned, you were in Norway. I want to bring us now to Gunn-Britt. Gunn-Britt Retter is going to speak on a kind of intergenerational justice of how we view this world, linking to what's just been said. She is an indigenous to the Saami ancestral home. She received degrees from the Saami University of Applied Scientists and the University of Wales. Her professional career focuses on incorporating indigenous people's knowledge into both research and action related to climate change, biodiversity, pollution, and natural resource management. She previously served on the Arctic Council's Indigenous Peoples Secretariat and has served the Saami Council for 17 years and is currently head of the Arctic and Environmental Unit. Gunn-Britt.
Thank you, Ologito. I grew up in a coastal Sami community in Varjat, Varanger, in northeast Norway. The Sami people live in Finland, Sweden, Russian Federation, and Norway today. My grandmother was born in early 1900s into a world with no plastic and was probably not introduced to plastic until she was an adult. She used to wash and reuse plastic bags until they were worn out, and she did this until she passed away in the 1980s. My mother did the same. And I guess many of you recognize this from your own households. I can only imagine my grandmother when she got acquainted with this wonderful material, thinking, what a fantastic, good and lasting material the plastic items are made of. I think she actually would feel bad just throwing it into the waste. In fact, we had very little waste, even when I grew up. I also imagine my grandmother concluding that a lot of resources must have gone into the making of such an enduring material. Thus, she has figured out she better make good use of it and also take good care of it. Well, the material is so good that we were able to simply make too much out of it. My grandmother lived through this transition from non-plastic to overproducing of plastic. In the Western world, we have, during my lifetime, turned into extreme consumers. Are the values my grandmother and mother represented still intact? And what can we learn from their way to relate to resources and waste, traditional practices and plastics? Is the next transition to circle back to these, what I consider universal values, we all should embrace? And actually today I demonstrate this practice with bringing my traditional guksi, my wooden cup, to meetings to represent the traditional values and practices of our past and present. During the pandemic, the Sami Council conducted in-depth interviews with some Sami elders about values. They raised many important values that are linked to the relationship Sami have with their respective ecosystems. The relationship in itself is a key value, which binds a person to their environment, its history and heritage. The relationship is reciprocal. People benefit from the gifts of nature, which brings a responsibility to maintain a balance within the ecosystem and to safeguard the healthy environment as a foundation of all life. Learning of indigenous knowledge, gaining a feeling of belonging, self-sufficiency, spirituality, mental and physical wellness, and social connections are some of the most valued aspects in the Saami relationship with the environment. Elaborate comparison of various values was seen as impossible, as there is no measure for doing that. Economic value of the gifts of nature can be measured in monetary terms, but it only captures one part of the value. Cultural values need to be considered as their own entity. In the Saami cosmology, human is seen as part of nature, not above other forms of life, and the role of human is to maintain harmony within the ecosystem, not to try to dominate nature. Guiding principles are modesty, taking only what is needed, and respect towards other beings, both as individuals and as populations. Human actions must not endanger the continuity of species and should not cause unnecessary harm to the individual beings who give their lives. Traditional Saami livelihoods and practices are therefore key for maintaining relationship within the ecosystem and acquiring knowledge of it. What is called wilderness by some is Mietsi for the Saami. Mietsi is an uninhabited area which is used for various purposes such as herding, fishing, gathering, trapping, and hunting. Mietsi provides us. It is a Saami cultural terrain, and we are the guardians of it. When Saami traditional use of ecosystems is disturbed by governance mechanisms like restrictions or selling of fishing quotas, hunting licenses for tourists, or resource extraction such as mining and forestry, and the new drive for energy projects, which we see in Sápmi, not only in the global south, is wind industry and rare and critical minerals mining, which are called for in the transition to green energy. And it's well needed, but at the same time, nothing else than a continuation of the consumption patterns and greed that bears many impacts on Saami communities as well. The elders that we interviewed raised a worry on the unsustainable path the world is at. Our current high standard of living is supported by unsustainable and unjust production practices around the globe. What is not sustainable cannot be sustained. We cannot build our future on an unstable ground. Our healthy ecosystems and our knowledge on how to sustainably exist as part of the ecosystems is what has kept us alive for millennia. Our ability and responsibility to maintain both healthy ecosystems and our indigenous knowledge through traditional use must be high priorities in ecosystem management. These are of the highest value. They are the foundations for our life and our safety net. Turning to these values as humanity is the true climate action. Think of your grandmothers, not to be old-fashioned, but to reflect on where you have come and where you want to be, and to be the change. And to address back to the seventh generation principle, which we know from other parts of the world, I think this Saami example relates to that principle as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Gunn-Britt. I want to highlight the values versus monetarization, which is often the latter is dominating the negotiations, to monetarize nature. The values, if this process were defined and prioritized by values. Many people call the climate crisis a spiritual crisis, and this side event is sponsored by 4 organizations with very strong spiritual grounding, so we thank you all for being here. My last and lovely speaker here, who's been very patient, Tahir Bulbulia. He is a youth leader from, and I quote, the beautiful Barbados. He possesses a bachelor in sports science and has passion for youth sports and national development. Additionally, Tahir has represented Barbados in various capacities to many international organizations and most recently was appointed as Barbados's youth ambassador to the UN. Tahir, bring us to our final speak.
Hi everyone, good afternoon. But firstly, before I jump in, I am amazed. I really have no words. I've just been sitting, soaking it all in. And I am very impressed by everyone. And it's a learning curve for me here this morning, sitting on this panel. So I am humbled to sit beside such amazing and esteemed people. So I think you need to give them a big round of applause. Secondly, I want you to also give a round of applause to the organizers and Lindsey for having the vision to coordinate an event like this with such diverse opinions, diverse views, different backgrounds, and just an amazing experience so far. This has been one of the better panels I've been on so far, most definitely. So I think we need to give them a round of applause as well. I'm from Barbados, a small island developing state which has been on the front line of the climate crisis. My Prime Minister has been leading the calls for the readjusting of the climate financing, how we view small island developing states, and the whole shift of how the global political structure is and the systems that we operate in. But before I jump in, a society is often judged by how it treats its most vulnerable and its minority groups. And transformation is seen in many instances and many examples, and many examples were used. But for me, and as a young person, transformation is a mindset. Transformation starts with the mind. And if we are able to transform our minds against a background that removes the historical context that we were dealing with, that's able to remove the things that hold us back from growing and operating and functioning at our best, that is when we can transform. Transformation is an everyday action that we must intentionally take of how we can impact our most vulnerable and have an impact on each and every person that we can come into contact with. So until we can see transformation as an intentional thing and an intentional action and an intentional value, taking in the values that my colleagues spoke on, that is when we can see true transformation, because transformation is in the mind. Sadly, the climate crisis is still seen as a very high-level conversation, led oftentimes by political leaders, policymakers, climate activists, environmentalists, you name it. But the climate crisis affects us all. The climate crisis has no name on it. It has no color. It has no religion. It just has big impacts and negative impacts on us all. So how can we achieve this transformation by attacking the climate crisis? The reality is, true climate action can only be seen when our most vulnerable understands the impact of the climate crisis. And as I said, sadly, the climate crisis is still seen as a very high-level conversation. Many young people out there don't understand the impacts of the climate crisis. So for that farmer who doesn't understand why their crops are not growing the way they grow anymore, to that young person who's suffering from mental health challenges, to those sports persons and athletes who don't understand why the grounds and the infrastructure is not the same as it was before. So we have to break down these conversations to the average person, to the average community, so that they can understand and they can be empowered to really take action against this climate crisis. Because until we do that, we will not truly understand the impact of it. And our people will not truly understand the impact of it. So we can talk all day on loss and damage. We can talk all day on mitigation. We can talk all day on adaptation. But the reality is that we have to break down this language and this challenge that we are facing to all people within our society. Thirdly, the reality is, as I mentioned, that the climate crisis affects us all. So how now do we bring every sector within our society on board with this mindset of transformation and operation? How can we do this? We have to educate them. We have to educate them and empower them. In my country, in Barbados, we have something called the National Transformation Initiative. And we launched Mission Transformation this year for 2030, where we want to transform and upskill and develop every Barbadian in every possible way. We would have launched educational campaigns in climate, where persons could go on and learn about the challenges we face in climate action, what they can do to become more sustainable in the way in which they operate. So we have to take these bold steps to help persons understand. Because the other reality is that the decisions we make today in these rooms will have an effect on us today. It's no longer tomorrow. You know, yesterday they used to say, the decisions we make today will affect us tomorrow. But no, the decisions we make today will have an effect on us today and are affecting us today. And as a young person, a society of people who do not know where they've come from, do not know where they're going. So we have to understand that many small island developing states are still grappling with the colonial past. And we are still on a ground where we're dealing with debt, we're dealing with infrastructural challenges, development challenges, financial system challenges that have not been catered for us. So when something happens in Russia or Ukraine, it still has an impact on us. The supply chain challenges, so our people can't eat. The prices, the inflation prices. The health challenges that we face, the health crisis that we face in the Caribbean, where 80% of our deaths in Barbados are from non-communicable diseases. So how is this linked to the climate crisis? How is this linked to the challenges that we all face? So we have to educate and empower our people so that we can transform them in every possible way. And then climate action can happen. And then it brings to peace and justice as a multiplier. Where peace and justice, as my colleague Harjeet spoke on equity, where we can have more equitable solutions, where persons can feel like they are transforming and growing. And then, and only then, will justice be achieved as a multiplier effect. So with that, thank you so very much.
Tahir, you may have said that you were honored to be on such a remarkable panel, but you are very much part of that remarkable panel. I want to go into questions, but I want to uphold a few things that were just said. Colonialism. Colonialism was finally identified in the IPCC Working Group 2 Adaptation. When I first walked in 10 years ago into the negotiating space, I realized they weren't just arguing about now. There were hundreds of years of hurt and abuse and anger in that room. And we need to talk about the hurt in the room and the injustice. And debt reduction is coming more into the fore, just as we're looking at the military. So I want to thank you for raising those, and I want to uphold the youth. And I want to say that those of us with gray hair are going to keep going too, because we uphold you.
Lindsey, you know, I'm often careful when they say youth, because all of us are youth. Because age is just a number, in my opinion. So all of us here are youthful and engaged. So when I say we're in a group of young people, the elder, experienced ones in the group, they look and say, but I'm young as well. I say, yes, you are. I love to hear that.
Young at heart. But we've got 15 minutes. I want to use them well. I'm sure you've got questions. Could I bring in maybe 2 questions to then feed back in? So we have a few at a time. Raise your hands, and we've got some amazing people with microphones that rush to you. Our first here with the red scarf, and then behind her.
Thanks so much, Lindsey. Maybe it's most contribution. One question for my Fulani person. I'm also Fulani coming from the West Africa. And the big deals or the big challenge is if you don't allow the pastoralism or if you don't allow the Fulanis to get access to the land, it's really very difficult for them, first. And secondly, in the West African, there are so much fighting in between Fulanis and the agriculture person. And that means we need to think about how we can organize these both communities, like the agriculture person and the Fulani person, who's really a pastoralism. Thanks.
Okay, and if you could pass the microphone back there, and we'll get, oh, you've got one.
Okay. Yeah, hi, my name is Knut Skagen. I'm a child psychiatrist from Norway. I'm here with International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War. First, I want to thank you all for what for me has been the best hour of the COP so far. This has been wonderful. I want to ask or address some of what you said, Deborah, that with the military spending, of the figures that you mentioned, $83 billion of those a year go to nuclear weapons alone. But when we look at the draft texts that are being worked on here, there's really nothing there about military activity, demilitarization. And defense ministers use climate change as an argument to increase their budget, saying that it is a threat they need to meet. So I just wonder if you have some words to us on how to move this conversation forward from the side event rooms into the negotiation rooms.
Okay, so we have two questions, and they both link very much to peace and justice. The first, looking at West Africa, but we're also talking about access to land and the concerns of the fighting. And the second, on military. Who would like to start first? Yes, please.
Okay, thank you very much for your contribution. I mean, for me, farmer-grazer conflict is not between cattle herder and agriculturalist. And for me, it is between the government authorities who miss or who doesn't make their job as well as they could. Because in Buskuda, the organization I'm leading in Cameroon, through our activities, we have been able to put in place the dialogue platform, farmer-grazer dialogue. And it has been working very well in the Northwest region where I come from. But suddenly the state had an issue with some separatists who now really want to control the area, and then they are fighting between themselves and using the farmer against the grazer, vice versa. So if it was, I think we cannot have food without meat, we cannot have meat without food. In Africa, for example, in our society, there are many vegetarians, but for us, it's linked. It's linked. So that's how we used to handle it. But also, traditionally, we have a traditional ruler and traditional rule, how to handle, how to live together for centuries. But since the demarcation, administrative demarcation arrived with the colonial aspect, so everything is divided, but make more disorder inside. Because normally, everybody is a neighbor in Africa, as you know. But now the authority can tell you that, okay, this place is cities and a periphery and everything is administratively delimited. But why it causes more and more problem that it should solve it. That's what I wanted to say. Between human, it can solve, but administration put more disorder for us.
Okay, thank you for raising the nuclear weapons spending. It's increasing. And I don't know what universe so-called leadership is sitting at when we are talking about the use of nuclear weapons again, in the face of global boiling. So last year at Sharm el-Sheikh, there were 2 side events on this topic. This year there are 8, both official side events, pavilion events, actions. So in a very short space of time, we're moving forward very quickly, even though the clock is ticking. And we have to say that that is primarily because of last year. Last year we were at COP. I was at COP for the first time talking about this, and we had Ukraine, we had the Russian invasion, and Ukraine brought the mainstream to this topic of understanding and seeing the impact of heavy bombardment emissions. So that got out there. This year, unbelievably, we are here watching what's happening in Gaza. And activists, the climate justice movement, the environmental movement are understanding, listen, there's the human, we see it, what's happening to people there. But there is this climate awareness in terms of the climate impact of what's happening there. But for us, fundamentally, critically, what's so important about this COP, that Gaza is enabling us to see, it is this link between military spending and military emissions. They are absolutely correlated. Israel is the 15th largest military spender in the world at $24 billion a year. So you are seeing what that war machine can do to a people that cannot defend themselves. So in terms of progress, we are making progress, as I say, even though the clock is ticking and we are running out of time. The media have got it now. Wherever we raise our voices on this, whether it's academic papers or it's those of us working at this sort of more advocacy campaigns end, the media are there and they are reporting it. At a more official level in terms of the UNFCCC, we are doing our best to push stuff in, and Lindsey is an incredible sort of ally and entry point on this. Honestly, I don't know where we would be without her and the information that goes in and the information that comes out in relation to the IPCC. We are calling for an IPCC special report on the role of the global military in climate change. We had a very interesting conversation last year at Sharm el-Sheikh with a senior IPCC figure who said, maybe you should be thinking about a special report on conflict emissions. Now, that would be an amazing step forward, because not only do we have what's going on in Ukraine, we have Gaza. We have submitted to the global stocktake. So there were 8 organizations. We got together and we put in a submission to the global stocktake on making sure that military emissions are in there. And we are also working on a submission to the UNFCCC, to the scientific body there, to get them to look at how military emissions need to be better factored in to reporting. So there is that kind of essential technical end. The wider media are picking up on it, and at this COP, I feel, because of Gaza, I feel that people know and they understand and they get the power and the politics and the money. Up against this climate finance, there is no money. There is absolutely money, and it's sitting inside what it is that governments are spending on their militaries, amongst other places.
Thank you. Thank you. And I want to bring some more questions while we still have time. Raising hands. Come on. Oh, we got one in the back. Yes. Anyone else? Do we have 2 questions at a time? Go on. Okay.
Thanks. I'm Laura Now. I'm from Natural Justice. And this panel was fantastic. I think speaking about money and power is really important. I focus on just energy transitions. So I think the question just to the panel is what I really struggle with just energy transitions and the emphasis on just is that there seems to be this narrative that if we move to renewable energy, then everything becomes just. And it doesn't from the work that we've looked at as natural justice with communities. It doesn't become just, and I think it was mentioned by the panel, especially by Gunn, about critical minerals mining. So it almost seems like an impossibility to change these systems. Is there any advice that each panel member can give on how we could move forward? I think just one more, just a comment about the military spending is I think it's such an important part that's been emphasized here, especially for Ukraine and Gaza, but I think it's also important to realize in Africa, we have continuous military operations going on to protect fossil fuels. So it would be nice for those instances to be highlighted, especially when it comes to gas and the protection of it. And it's not just by African militaries, it's by foreign militaries that have come in to protect those resources. Thanks.
And the second.
Oh, yeah. This is merely a comment. My name is Paul Genot. I'm with the United Nations Environment Program in Haiti. I work on climate security, climate justice, human rights, but I'm not here on behalf of my corporation saying what I'm going to say. First, I want to congratulate this panel. It's been the best panel I've attended seriously all week. So congratulations. Now, it's only a remark. I'm personal, very personal remark. I find that there's a very important player who is not part of this dialogue and conversation, which is the corporation, the multinational corporation. And these have a lot of influence on governments. And it's extremely difficult to rule these very important players in the background of all that we're working on here. And so my question is, what can we do? How can we regain control of this overspending, overconsumption that is a big part of, this greenhouse gas problem? How can we live in a peaceful society when 1 out of 2 video games is about war? I have this iPhone in my purse, and a few weeks ago I dropped it in the pool, and they offered to replace it for me. I don't want a replacement. I want to keep my iPhone. I want it working. How can we, go against this trend that is being set by these multinational corporations and regain back control? Thank you.
Because we're going to be cut off in 3 minutes, I want to first say with these two questions as they're related also, if Olaf online wanted to talk about more equitable and just renewable energies. Is Olaf there?
Yes.
Yeah, Olaf,
Thank you,
did you want to
Lindsey.
say something?
I can say one quick thing, which is that when we think about a more equitable transition, and sorry, I'm getting some feedback. The process that we go through, when I say we haven't explored it, we don't know quite what would happen if there were a more equitable transition that involved a drawdown in certain wealthy parts of the world and wealthy societies and members of societies. What the dynamics might be, and that includes actually linking to the military sector what the security dynamics would be around a change in geopolitical power linked to resources, whether that's the increasing importance of minerals for a decarbonization process, but also a reduction of fossil fuel production. And what happens when the last producers and suppliers of fossil energy, who they might be, and it looks like in the long term they would lose geopolitical power through decarbonization, but in the shorter run, we need to think about what happens when fossil producers and exporters form alliances and potentially try to protect that form of industry and extraction. We have to think about those dynamics. At least that's a small part of it, but I think it's a great question.
Thank you. And I want to open to the panel for both of those linked questions. Would anybody else like to? Gunn-Britt.
Yes, thank you. Well, I don't know, I'm quite naive, I guess, to these discussions, but I think people just we have to be more energy efficient and focus on less consumption. And isn't it so also that 1% of the richest in the world have to reconsider their consumptions? But I don't know, and I don't know exactly how to force that to happen. And because I sense that people in general just want to continue as before, drive as much as before, and just do it more environmentally friendly. So by more people in Norway having electrical cars, they actually drive more because they can now afford also a second car. There was a report that said some years ago. So we have to have this mind shift of we have to change, we not seek opportunities to continue as before, just
trying to do it more environmentally friendly, because in the long run it isn't. Thank you.
Thank you. Catherine. Oh, sorry. Catherine, do you want?
Excellent question. Just want to make a quick point before Catherine goes. We can create all these systems in the world, and we often talk on systemic change. But the reality is who are systems managed by? The people. People manage systems. So as much as we talk on technological development, you still need a person to manage the system. So we have to meet people where they're at. And I think that's one of our biggest challenges that we face all over the world. Meeting people where they're at, educating and empowering them to understand the effects of the systemic change, or the shifts that is happening, or the transformation that we are speaking to. And this is one of the biggest challenges that we face in small island developing states. In Barbados, people are so resistant to transformation because they're fixed mindsets, fixed way of operation, fixed way of doing things. They're accustomed just driving everywhere. They're accustomed doing certain stuff. So we have to meet people where they're at and understand that systems are managed by people. So I just wanted to be really brief there.
Thank you, Tahir. And we have one sentence left from Catherine, and then we do have to finish.
Yeah, just to say on the point around corporations, I think the best thing corporations can do is pay their taxes and respect their obligation, or rather fulfill their obligation to respect human rights. The corporations that have caused this crisis will not be offering us solutions. Their metric for success is profit and growth, and this space it should be a party-driven process that is mandated by party citizens to advance human rights. So we really, really need to ensure that we kick polluters out of this space, that polluters pay, and that there is a conflict of interest policy that is developed by the UNFCCC to protect the integrity of the Paris Climate Agreement and the UNFCCC. Thank you.
And thank you, Catherine. And on that, we need people to take there is a consequence to their actions, and those need to be held accountable. Thank you so much, everyone. And there are publications at the end to take before you go. Thank you.